Weeds choke the doorway. Paint peels off warped clapboards. A hand-painted sign still reads, "Cider Mill," fading into the wood grain itself. This isn't just an abandoned barn. It's a tombstone for a national habit America spent 3 centuries building, then forgot in 1 generation. Author Michael Pollan put it bluntly. Up until Prohibition, an apple grown in America was far less likely to be eaten than to wind up in a barrel of cider. Read that twice. The apple you picture as a snack was, for most of American history, a drink. For nearly 300 years, cider was the default American beverage. Not beer, not coffee, cider. Farmers drank it at lunch. Children drank a weak version at breakfast. It was safer than water and cheaper than almost anything else on the table. Behind every mug was a mill. Small, wooden, often built from a converted grist mill, powered by a turning water wheel or a plodding horse. They dotted New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the seasonal engine of an entire rural economy. Every autumn, wagons loaded with apples rolled toward these mills. Grinders crushed the fruit into pulp. Hydraulic presses squeezed out the juice. The smell of fermenting pomace hung over entire villages for weeks. This was the rhythm of the harvest season. One of the oldest surviving structures still standing is Allen's Cider Mill in Granby, Connecticut, built in 1783 on just 1.5 acres. It's now listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a rare survivor of a vanished landscape. In New York, a miller named Hosea Williams built something bigger, a water turbine, driving a mechanized grinder and press at Fly Creek. It worked so well that neighboring farmers abandoned their hand presses almost overnight, switching to his mill instead. These weren't dedicated cider houses to begin with. Many started as grist mills grinding grain, only pivoting to apples after floods, obsolescence, or shifting markets forced their owners to reinvent them. The cider identity was often a second act, not a first calling. In New Jersey, the Ralston Mill began in 1848 as a water-powered grist mill above Burnett Brook, between Mendham and Chester. Decades later, it would become known for cider and for a persistent local legend of secret tunnels tied to its Prohibition past. By the late 1800s, cider mills stretched across the Northeast and Midwest like a hidden circulatory system, hundreds of them, each tied to its own orchard, its own family, its own blend of apple varieties bred over generations for the press, not the plate. In Michigan, Alba Orchards installed an 1890 Mount Gilead hydraulic press that farmers still relied on decades into the 20th century. By 1903, Charles Klager built his own mill using a gas-powered version of that same Ohio-made press, proof of how mechanized cider making had become. This was a fully formed industry, regional, mechanized, and deeply embedded in daily life. Nothing about it suggested it would vanish. And yet, within 20 years, the entire structure holding it up would be dismantled, piece by piece, starting with the orchards themselves. Some mills didn't just survive. They got dated, documented, deeded. In Granby, Connecticut, a press house built in 1783 still stands on 1.5 acres of ground, its timbers older than the country itself. In 1992, it earned a number, National Register Reference 92389. A bureaucratic string of digits, but it means something rare. Proof, on paper, that this is one of the oldest cider mill structures left standing in America. But paperwork doesn't settle everything. Up the road in Glastonbury, locals swear their mill is older still. Its press once turned by a horse, walking endless circles, grinding apples long before anyone thought to write it down. No registry ever settled the argument. There is no single ledger of America's oldest cider mill, just competing memories, town pride, and a horse-powered legend that refuses to lose to a filing cabinet in Hartford. Most of these mills, though, didn't start as cider mills at all. They started as grist mills, grinding wheat and corn until a flood or a market shift forced their owners to reinvent them completely. In Mendham, New Jersey, above Burnett Brook, a water-powered grist mill went up in 1848. It ground grain for decades before it ever pressed a single apple, before it became known as the Ralston Mill. Locals still whisper about tunnels beneath it, passages supposedly used to move liquor quietly during Prohibition. No records confirm them, but the story persists, the way old buildings collect legends, the way barns collect dust. Further north, the Franklin Grist Mill met a harder fate. In the early 1900s, floodwater tore through it and shut it down for good, or so it seemed, until a man named Robert McKee saw an opportunity in the ruin. In 1918, McKee bought the wrecked grist mill and rebuilt its purpose entirely. Instead of grinding wheat, it would press apples, one season a year, every autumn, for what its owners now call nearly 200 years of legacy. This is the pattern again and again. A mill dies as one thing and gets reborn as another. Cider wasn't always the plan. It was often the second chance a ruined building was given. Then came the machines that made hand presses obsolete overnight. In upstate New York, a man named Hosea Williams looked at Fly Creek and saw something bigger than a farm chore. He saw horsepower running for free. He rigged a turbine to the creek and used it to drive a grinder and a hydraulic press, a machine that could crush and squeeze apples faster than any arm ever could, hour after hour, without tiring. Neighbors noticed fast. Within seasons, farmers who had pressed cider by hand for generations abandoned their own equipment and hauled their apples to Williams' mill instead. The first small industrial revolution most of them had ever seen. It was a quiet kind of conquest. No explosions, no headlines, just one turbine proving that muscle and time were no longer required. Mills like his would soon multiply across the Northeast, each one changing how fast an apple could disappear. Michigan caught the momentum next. In 1890, Alba Orchards installed a Mount Gilead hydraulic press, a machine so well built it still runs today, over a century later, squeezing the same varieties of apples its first owners planted. By 1903, Charles E. Klager built his own mill at 6111 South Main Street, running a gas-powered version of the same Mount Gilead design. Cider wasn't a nostalgic craft yet. It was current technology, upgraded like any other industry of its era. Southeast Michigan's Washtenaw County traces its cider lineage back over 300 years, proof that this wasn't a regional fad. It was inherited knowledge, passed farm to farm, mill to mill, for as long as Americans had been growing apples at all. Then, in 1920, the Volstead Act became law. It didn't just outlaw selling alcohol, it named hard cider a criminal product and turned every fermenting barrel in the country into contraband overnight. National prohibition lasted 13 years, from 1920 to 1933. For an industry built on trees that take a decade to mature, 13 years wasn't a pause. It was long enough to erase a generation of orchards entirely. Enforcement didn't stop at padlocking taverns. Bands of raiders moved through the countryside with axes and torches, burning and chopping down cider apple orchards outright, destroying the raw supply, not just the finished drink. This is the detail most people miss about Prohibition. The law targeted commerce, but the raids targeted agriculture. You can repeal a statute in an afternoon. You cannot regrow a 15-year-old apple tree the same way. So when repeal finally came in 1933, farmers didn't replant what they'd lost. They planted something safer, eating apples, crisp, sweet, snackable varieties that had nothing to do with fermentation, and everything to do with surviving the next crackdown. Within a generation, the switch was nearly total. The tart, bitter, tannic apples that once defined regional ciders, Michigan blends, New England blends, each with its own character, quietly disappeared from American orchards. That wasn't just a loss of flavor, it was a loss of genetic library. Decades of grafting, breeding, and regional adaptation, gone because nobody had a legal reason to keep growing those specific trees anymore. Beer had a different fate. Breweries never fully shut their doors. They pivoted to root beer, ginger ale, malt syrup, anything legal that kept the equipment running and the workforce employed until the law changed back. Cider had no such fallback. There was no legal, profitable version of a cider mill to keep the lights on. When Prohibition ended, brewers restarted production in weeks. Cider makers had almost no orchards left to press. So the American apple came out the other side of Prohibition permanently rewritten, no longer primarily a drink waiting to ferment, but a fruit meant to be eaten fresh, sold whole, and judged by how it looked in a grocery bin. Sweet cider survived where hard cider had died. Mills that once fermented barrels for winter now bottled unfermented juice for weekend drives, roadside stands, and school field trips. Apples reduced to a seasonal souvenir instead of a staple. The old presses kept turning, but for a different crowd. Families came for hayrides and donuts, not fermentation. The mill became a stop on the calendar, October ritual, not year-round necessity. Many of these buildings would not make it to the next century intact. By the late 1900s, dozens sat abandoned, roofs sagging, presses rusting, signs peeling in the weather. Preservation, when it came, would not come from any government agency. In Levittown, New York, one such barn stood on borrowed time. Kimlin's Cider Mill had pressed apples for most of the 20th century. By 2000, developers eyed the land it sat on. So a handful of residents did something small towns rarely do anymore. They organized. In May 2000, they formed Cider Mill Friends of Open Space and Historic Preservation. No developer's budget, no state backing, just neighbors with a petition. By January 2001, they were a registered nonprofit. Then came 7 more years of hearings, fundraising, and paperwork. An unglamorous war fought in municipal offices, not on any battlefield. In February 2008, the fight ended. Kimlin's Cider Mill won historic designation, 8 years after that first meeting, saved not by any institution's foresight, but by people who simply refused to let it fall. What they saved was stranger than a simple landmark. Kimlin's owner had spent decades filling the barn with old farm tools, wildlife taxidermy, and Native American artifacts, stacked beside the cider press itself. Commerce and curiosity cabinet, tangled together under one roof. Visitors came for a jug of cider and left having walked through an accidental museum nobody had planned to build. Farther upstate, another mill faced the same odds without any nonprofit behind it. North Branch Cider Mill sat rotting, weeds through the floorboards, windows broken, its hand-painted sign fading into the red paint. One couple drove past it and couldn't leave it there. No grant, no committee, just 2 people who saw a building dying and decided, on their own, to stop it. It's part of a quiet wave. Dozens of these before and after rescues since the early 2000s. Each one powered by the same unofficial force, a private person who couldn't stand watching a barn fall down. These mills once stood because whole communities needed them, every farm pressing its harvest into a shared vat. Today, they stand for the opposite reason. One household's stubborn attachment to a single building. That's the arc, from colonial necessity to personal devotion. The habit that once defined a nation's thirst is gone. What's left is a scattering of barns, saved one at a time by people who simply couldn't watch them disappear. If that story is worth remembering, subscribe.